welcome to our election update. My name is Greg Hansen. I'm the Managing Director of Trust Investments at Legacy Private Trust. And joining me on the call today are two of our portfolio managers, Peter Schaefer and Connor O'Brien. Peter is going to moderate the call today, and I'll ask him to join us in just a second. But as you can see on the screen, these are the topics that we're going to cover. We'll look at the policy proposals from both candidates. We'll look at an election forecast. We'll look at election year seasonality and how that impacts trends in the markets. And then we'll wrap up with a few final thoughts. So with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Perfect. Thanks, Greg. Happy to be here. Happy to moderate today's call. I think we can just get right in. These two candidates, Greg, from what I've heard, have very different proposals regarding economic policies. Now, there are some differences and there are some similarities. I was hoping, Greg, you could just kind of walk us through a high-level overview.
Sure. I won't go into detail on everything that you see on the screen here, but I think the big thing starts at the top with taxes. So going back to 2017, we had the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and all of the provisions from that are set to expire at the end of 2025. Both candidates would like to renew those cuts, or at least part of those cuts. And as you can see on the screen here, Vice President Harris would allow the 2017 cuts to expire for households making more than $400,000 per year, while former President Trump wants to renew all of the cuts. Both candidates are proposing increases in the child tax credits, and Harris would like to increase the tax on corporate buybacks to 4%. Currently, that's a number that's at 1%, and so that would be a little bit of a change from where we sit today. On trade, Vice President Harris seems to favor the status quo, while Donald Trump wants to increase tariffs on imported goods, including a 60% tariff on imports from China, partially to offset the impact of the tax cuts that he's looking to re-up. There are a few differences on policy proposals for immigration, which has a large impact on the labor force and housing markets. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those or the defense and healthcare, but as you can see on the screen here, these are the things that they have proposed. And I guess I would say the one thing that we're not seeing as much of this year as we have in past years is communication on these policies. So this is our best guess as to what is actually being proposed out there, but candidates just don't seem to be talking policy as much this year as they have in past election cycles. So on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, some of the major themes that we're looking at for 2025. Some of the provisions from 2017 were permanent, and that included the corporate tax rate reduced to 21% from 35%, the elimination of the corporate alternative minimum tax, and the expanded bonus depreciation. But things that are expiring here going into the end of 2025, without any action, we'll see a revision to 39.6% for the top federal tax rate from the current 37% level. In 2017, the act increased the threshold for the alternative minimum taxes. Without action, those will revert back to the pre-2017 levels. And we'll also see the elimination of the $2,000 child tax credit and expanded standard deductions. But the one big thing that we're watching is a change in the lifetime estate tax exclusions, as you can see at the beginning there. It does not impact a large portion of the population, but in our business, many of the people that we work with would be impacted. So it's something that we're going to be following closely. If the current limits were to revert from the current 11.2 million, with the inflation adjustments now, that's a total of about 13 million per person or 26 million per couple. If they were allowed to revert, that would drop down to 5.6 million per person, more than a 50% reduction in the amount of assets that can be passed to others without estate taxes. So that's going to impact a lot of people. I think in particular families that have wealth, but business owners and farmers as well. So definitely something that we're going to be keeping our eye on.
So Greg, my thunder was kind of stolen. We saw the next slide here, but I wanted to circle back and just talk a little bit about the corporate tax rate. We've seen some different proposals. I think President Trump wants to reduce that corporate tax rate, while Vice President Harris wants to increase that corporate tax rate. Obviously, not every stock is created equal. So I guess just walk me through a little bit from an earnings perspective. Are there some sectors that'll be more sort of sensitive to this than others? Just some of your thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's important to realize that there's a high correlation between earnings and stock market levels and price changes. And so that's why we focus on this as much as we do. As you mentioned, PJ, not all sectors are going to be hit the same by the changes in the tax laws. For every 1 percentage point increase that we see in tax rates, we would expect to see a little more than a 1% hit to the earnings of the Russell 2000 or the small cap companies. Reason for that, they just don't have as many deductions as some of the other sectors do, or ways of, I'll say, hiding, for lack of a better term, corporate profits made overseas. So the 1% increase in rates would impact small caps the most. You'd also see consumer discretionary and communication services hit. Some of the other sectors, you can see more like a 60 to 70% impact for every 1%. So 0.6, 0.7 of 1% decrease in earnings for every small increase in tax. Jumping over to the right side of the screen, looking at the proposed corporate taxes and what that could mean for the S&P as a whole. If we see tax cuts come through as they've been proposed, that could mean as much as a 4% increase in corporate earnings. And this really refers to the statutory rate cut going from 21% down to 15%. On the other hand, if we see corporate taxes increase, that's going to have a negative impact on earnings. You can see the combination of factors that will come into play there. So it's a minimum rate hike, statutory rate hike, foreign tax hike. All of those factors together would be a combined 8% decline in earnings for the S&P 500. So it's about a 2-to-1 ratio of downside in earnings to upside in earnings, depending on whether we get tax cuts or tax increases.
Yeah, so that's going to be a pretty big impact on sort of the corporate tax rate and earnings. I want to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit more about policy. It sounded like both candidates are going to be spending. So I guess, just a little bit of color on where we think the deficit might look like with either candidate.
You're absolutely correct, PJ. Both candidates will be spending and increasing the deficit, just that they've elected to do it a little bit differently here. The main reason the 2017 cuts are set to expire is because at the time they were enacted, they had such a large impact on the deficit that was the only way they could get those passed through Congress. They had to have a sunset provision in them. And so if they are extended, according to the Congressional Budget Office estimates, they'll add around 1 to 2% per year to the the federal deficit. What you're seeing here on the screen, the blue sectors are the increases in revenues under Harris on the left and Trump on the right, how the next 10 years would look. You'd see increases coming through from the Harris proposals for corporate tax hikes, taxes on the wealthy, and other revenue raisers that she's proposed. On the Trump side, it's increasing of the universal tariff, a repeal of the clean energy subsidies, and then an increase to 60% on tariffs on China. So those are the revenue sides, and then you can see all the different things that they've put in as proposals in the gold bars. Those are the items that will increase the deficit or create deficit spending here. And so it's the tax cuts and elimination of Social Security benefits, taxes on the Trump side, extending the tax cuts for those under 400,000 for Vice President Harris, child care and learning and so on. When you sum all of those things together, the focus here really needs to be on the red lines at the bottom. And you can see both candidates are looking to do deficit spending. It's really seems to be the hallmark of their proposals. The real difference is just the magnitude of that. And again, this is the Congressional Budget Office's attempt to size that up. But over the next 10 years, Vice President Harris is looking at a little more than $1 trillion of deficit spending, and former President Trump is going to be close to $4 trillion of deficit spending.
Sure. Well, before we get to the actual deficit spending, we have to get through the actual election. So, Connor, I want to pivot to you now. So get ready. You're back here on the hot seat. Before we start talking about the election and sort of what might happen, just give me a quick breakdown of the landscape as it stands today, what the current administration looks like.
Yeah, so currently Democrats hold a thin majority in the Senate, right? 51 out of 100 seats, while Republicans hold a slim majority in the House, right? So Congress has been divided for the last 2 years. The seats that are up for re-election in the Senate heavily favor Republicans. The seat held by Senator Manchin in West Virginia is a near certainty to flip red. John Tester, the Democratic senator from Montana, will likely lose to Tim Sheehy. So there you have two seats that will very, very likely flip from red or from blue to red, taking the Republicans from a minority to a majority at 51. You also have Ohio at basically a coin flip. So you're probably looking at 51, maybe 52 seats for Republicans when the dust settles in the Senate. The House is even tighter. It really comes down to a few races in a few swing states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona all have districts that are a toss-up. Democrats probably have a thin majority and probability to take back the House from Republicans. Currently, Republicans have 220. But the reality is that whatever way the House goes, the presidency will probably go as well.
Perfect. Honestly, it sounds like you have your crystal ball out right now. So this is fantastic because we did just have an interesting update yesterday. Election betting is now officially legal here in the US. So I'm not specifically asking for your predictions, but tell me a little bit about just an update on sort of current outlook polling, things like that for the election next month.
Yeah, so this looks at just the White House. Let's focus on that first. This looks at current polling, right? And this is national polling. It's not state by state. It's not bottom up. It's national polling. And Harris currently holds about a 3.5% lead on former President Trump. Since the dust settled with Biden dropping out and Harris taking control and so on and so forth, she's pretty consistently led between 2 and 2.5%. Now, keep in mind, this is national polling, and as we know, the popular vote does not decide the president, right? That's why we have the Electoral College. And even though Harris has a pretty good chance to win the popular vote, the Electoral College is what matters, and the electoral map heavily swings or tilts towards Republicans. The 7 key swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and most importantly, Pennsylvania, the polling in those states is a bit more favorable to Republicans than the national ballot, particularly in what will likely be the most important tipping point state, and that's Pennsylvania. Whatever way Pennsylvania goes, very, very likely not only the presidency, the White House, but the House will go as well. And at the end of the day, this race from an electoral college perspective is as close as you can get to a toss-up, and it will likely come down to a few counties in Pennsylvania that will decide that. PJ, you talked about the betting markets. The betting markets have gotten a sort of a bad rap in the past, but with the popularity of them and with them now becoming legal here in the US, they've been legal outside of the US for a while. Those betting markets are starting to get a lot larger and a lot more liquid, which has made them at least a little bit more predictive and better at showing us the current lay of the land. The betting markets right now reflect largely what we kind of talked about. The betting markets say that, when it comes to the presidency, call it a coin flip. When it comes to the Senate, probably leaning towards Republicans. It'll be hard for Democrats to hold on to that. And the House, while it, as we said before, might lean a little bit Democratic, at the end of the day, you could qualify that as a toss-up, just like the presidency.
Perfect. Well, hey, at the end of the day, I think, as much as we like to read about policy and as much as we like to read about elections and predictions, at the end of the day, us three, we are portfolio managers. So from a market perspective, Connor, what are we looking for, whether it's the most likely scenarios or really the most profitable scenarios for how the government could sort of shake out after this election and how it impacts markets?
Yeah, so let's just look at historical market performance. The old adage that we all hear is that markets generally like gridlock. And the two most likely scenarios today are either a Republican sweep, which is at the second from the top, or it's going to be the second from the bottom where you get a Harris presidency with a split Congress, right? And The more important point here is that not only are both of those factors or scenarios generally pretty good for the market, the broader point here is that the markets can do well irrespective of who's in what, right? The markets don't like uncertainty, but there's really not an unknown here, right? One of these two scenarios are very, very likely to happen, and the markets may shake around a little bit during election week, post-election, but whatever happens, it's not like the markets won't have already considered that as a possibility. The main message being, just don't trade around elections, right? That's what we're trying to get across. And that's your takeaway from this slide. Now, just as important, we often hear about that jitteriness either during the election or before the election. Usually September, October are fairly weak months, or at least we hear that fact thrown around. The reality is that the jitteriness tends to happen mostly in election years with a recession. In election years where we avoid a recession, which are all the election years aggregated in blue on this chart, and it will also very, very likely be this year as well, the markets tend to do just fine, right? And either way, whether there's a recession or not during an election year, November and December tend to be favorable years no matter what year it is, election years, non-election years. November, December are just generally good months to be in the market, no matter the scenario.
Yeah, and I think with these two candidates, we often talk about a relief rally that we get once we get through the election, we get into November and December and into next year. I can speak for you, Connor and Greg. We don't think this year is going to be any different. We do feel pretty comfortable with the markets. And so I'll kind of wrap it up and just say, Greg, Connor, thank you very much for being a part of the call today, letting me moderate and ask you questions. For those of you listening, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your Legacy advisor. If you are not a part of Legacy already, feel free to reach out to us at info@lptrust.com. Thank you very much.